deep within the sepulchral halls of the fortress monastery, where shadows cling to ancient stone and the air itself seems heavy with the weight of millennia, the tech marines gather in solemn procession. Their crimson robes brush against floors worn smooth by 10,000 years of reverent footfalls, and the soft chanting of binary cant echoes through corridors that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They carry with them the sacred unguents, the blessed oils, the activation protocols passed down through generations of keepers, who understood that what they tend is far more than mere machinery. The chamber they enter is a shrine and a tomb in equal measure. Incense smoke drifts in lazy spirals toward vaulted ceilings, lost in darkness, while servo skulls hover at the periphery, their augmetic eyes recording everything for the chapter's eternal archives. At the chamber's heart stands the object of their pilgrimage, a towering sarcophagus of adamantium and ceramite, its surface etched with honor marks so numerous they form a metallic constellation of glory. Battle honors from campaigns whose names have been forgotten for 5,000 years sit alongside more recent engravings, a continuous record of service that spans the entire history of the Imperium itself. This is no ordinary dreadnought. The tech marines know this in their bones, in the way their mechadendrites tremble slightly as they approach, in how even the machine spirits of their own augmetics seem to grow quiet and respectful in its presence. The nameplate, worked in gold that has never tarnished despite the crushing weight of ages, bears a designation that predates the Codex Astartes, predates the Horus Heresy, predates even the Great Crusade that scattered humanity's armies across the stars. Brother Artellus, master of the forge, leads the awakening rites. His hands, more metal than flesh after 3 centuries of service, move with practiced precision as he interfaces with the ancient systems. Activation runes flicker to life across the dreadnought's chassis, pale green ghosts in the gloom. Life support systems that have maintained their silent vigil for decades begin to hum, a sound that builds from barely perceptible to a deep thrumming that resonates in the chests of every marine present. Around them, the chapter's chaplains have formed a circle, their skull helms turned toward the awakening giant. They know what this moment represents. In 10,000 years of service to the Emperor, this dreadnought has been awakened fewer than 50 times, reserved only for moments when the chapter faces its darkest hours, or when wisdom is needed that only one who walked alongside gods can provide. Each awakening is a gift and a burden, for the being within has seen things that no mortal mind was meant to remember, carried memories that grow heavier with each passing century. The amniotic fluids within the sarcophagus begin to circulate, thick and dark as old blood. Neural connectors activate, sending gentle electrical pulses through synapses that have slumbered in dreamless void. The dreadnought's optical sensors brighten from dull red to burning amber, swiveling as they focus on the chamber around them. Somewhere deep within the chassis, a vox system crackles to life, producing sounds like the grinding of continental plates before settling into something approximating speech. "Who awakens me?" The voice is not human, not really. It carries harmonics impossible for flesh and blood to produce, a mechanical rasp overlaid with echoes of what might once have been a human timbre. But there's something else too, something that makes every marine in the chamber straighten unconsciously. It's the voice of someone who has seen too much, endured too long, and yet somehow maintained the core of what they once were. Chaplain Mordecai steps forward, his Crozius Arcanum held before him like a ward. Ancient Tiberius, first of his name, bearer of the Aquila Eternal, last of the Unification Wars. We awaken you because the chapter stands at a crossroads, and we have need of the wisdom you alone can provide. There is a long pause, and those who have witnessed previous awakenings know this is when the ancient consciousness is orienting itself, piecing together when he is and what has transpired since last he walked. Time is strange for those who sleep away the centuries. A dreadnought awakens to find that decades have passed in what felt like an eye blink, that brothers he knew are dust, that the galaxy he remembers has shifted in ways both subtle and profound. How long? The question comes eventually, as it always does. 67 years, Ancient One, since last you graced us with your counsel. Another pause, shorter this time. 67, so few, yet I feel the weight of them. The dreadnought's chassis shifts, servos whining as the ancient warrior tests his systems, ensuring that the long sleep has not degraded his capacity to serve. You say the chapter stands at a crossroads. Tell me what troubles you, sons of my son's sons. But before Chaplain Mordecai can speak, the youngest Marine in the chamber, a brother who earned his place in the honor guard mere weeks ago, steps forward. His voice carries an edge of desperate need. Ancient One, forgive my presumption, but we need more than tactical wisdom. We need truth. Every head turns toward the young Marine. Such interruption of sacred ceremony would normally be cause for severe censure, but something in the Marine's voice gives them pause. Brother Cassius! Mordecai's warning is clear, but the young Marine continues, his words tumbling out in a rush that speaks of long-suppressed questions finally breaking free. You served in the Unification Wars. You walked the battlefields of terror when they still bore names we've forgotten. You fought alongside the Thunder Warriors, the Custodians, the first Space Marines ever created. He takes a step closer, and now his voice drops to something just above a whisper. You stood in the presence of the Emperor himself, not the corpse god on the golden throne that we're taught to worship, not the distant deity whose will is interpreted by high lords and ecclesiarchs. You knew him when he walked and spoke and led us in person. The chamber has gone deathly silent. Even the chaplains, who should be outraged at such borderline heretical speech, remain frozen. Because this is the question that haunts every thinking Marine who serves the Imperium, the gulf between faith and history that yawns wider with each passing century. The chapter faces enemies without, Brother Cassius continues, his voice gaining strength. Chaos cults have risen in 3 neighboring systems. Xenos fleets mass at the sector's edge. But that's not what troubles me, Ancient One. What troubles me is that I don't know what I'm fighting for anymore. Not really. We're told we serve the Emperor's will, but how can we know his will when everything we're taught about him might be lies? When the Imperium he founded has become something he would have destroyed during the Unification? Brother Cassius speaks out of turn, Mordecai says, but his voice lacks conviction. He will face censure for his no. The single word from the Dreadnought cuts through the chamber like a power sword through flesh. There is a weight to it that goes beyond volume, a finality that brooks no argument. The boy asks the right questions, the only questions that matter. Ancient Tiberius's optical sensors fix on the young Marine, and Cassius finds himself unable to look away. You wish to know the truth about the Emperor, about what he was before the Imperium made him into a god, about the man I knew, the warlord I served, the vision he carried that shaped everything you see around you. Yes, Ancient One. And you understand that the truth may not bring you comfort, that knowing the Emperor as he was might make your faith harder, not easier. I understand, but I need to know. We all need to know. The Dreadnought is silent for a long moment, and those who know him best can see something in his posture shifting, a decision being made. When he speaks again, his voice carries a resonance it had lacked before, as if drawing on reserves of strength held in abeyance. Then I will tell you, not as the scribes have written it, sanitized for mass consumption, not as the ecclesiarchy preaches it, twisted to serve their own power. I will tell you what I remember, what I saw with my own eyes in the days before any of you were born, before your chapters existed, before the very concept of the Space Marine had been perfected. I will tell you about the Emperor as he was, and you will decide for yourselves what that means for what you must become. He pauses, and when he continues, There's something almost like sadness in his synthesized voice. But understand this, all of you. Once I speak these words, they cannot be unspoken. Once you know what I know, you bear the same burden I have carried for 10 millennia. The burden of truth in an Imperium built on faith. The burden of memory in an age that has forgotten. Are you certain you want this? Brother Cassius doesn't hesitate. We are certain, Ancient One. Very well. The Dreadnought's stance shifts, settling into a posture that suggests he's preparing for a very long conversation. Then let me tell you about the day I first met the Emperor of Mankind. And let me start by saying this. He was not what you expect. Who walks in iron? To understand who speaks, you must first understand what he was before the sarcophagus, before the centuries of service, before the transformation that took a man and made him into something that would outlive empires. Tiberius was not always ancient. There was a time, impossibly distant now, when he walked on 2 legs of flesh and bone, when he breathed air that hadn't been filtered through recyclers, when he knew the simple pleasure of removing armor at day's end and feeling wind on skin. He was born on Terra during the Age of Strife, in a time when Earth's birthplace had degenerated into something barely recognizable as the cradle of humanity. The world was a patchwork of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms, atomic wastelands, and enclaves of darkness where things that should not exist crawled forth from holes in reality. The warp storms that had cut humanity off from its stellar empire raged through the solar system, and on Terra itself, warlords with access to Dark Age technology carved out kingdoms built on the bones of the previous civilization. Tiberius remembers his childhood, though the memories have taken on a dreamlike quality after so many millennia. He was born in a settlement on the edge of what ancient maps had called Europa, in a world where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to read, where every day was a battle against starvation, radiation, or the armies of rival kingdoms that swept across the devastated landscape like locusts. His father was a soldier in one of the 100 Kings' armies. His mother a scavenger who picked through the ruins of the old world for technology that might give their settlement an edge in the eternal wars. He was 12 years old when he first killed a man. Not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was watching his younger sister be dragged away by raiders whose kingdom worshipped a machine god that demanded human sacrifice to keep the generators running. He doesn't remember the man's face anymore, doesn't remember if he screamed or died silently. What he remembers is the weight of the metal bar in his hands, the resistance of skull against steel, and the moment when he understood that his childhood had ended. By 15, he was a full soldier in the army of one of the Frank warlords, a brutal leader who maintained control through a combination of Dark Age energy weapons and genetically engineered horrors that had once been human. By 17, he had watched his entire unit die in a battle against the forces of the Pan-Pacific Empire, had survived only because he was faster than his brothers when the enemy's rad weapons turned their armor into ovens that cooked them alive. And then the Emperor came. The histories speak of the Unification Wars as if they were a glorious crusade, a righteous campaign to bring order to chaos. They weren't. They were brutal, grinding conflicts that lasted decades and left millions dead. The Emperor's Thunder Warriors were weapons of mass destruction given human form, berserkers who could tear through defensive lines like paper, but who paid for their power with their sanity and their lives. Tiberius fought against them 3 times before his warlord's kingdom fell, and each time he counted himself fortunate to escape with his life. When the Emperor's forces finally conquered his region, Tiberius expected to die. That's what happened to soldiers on the losing side. You died, or if you were lucky, you were enslaved. But the Emperor had a different vision. He wasn't interested in ruling over a planet of slaves and corpses. He wanted loyal soldiers, skilled warriors who could be forged into something greater. Tiberius was 23 years old when he was selected for transformation. The process that would turn him into one of the first Space Marines was still being perfected. still crude compared to what would come later. The surgeries lasted for months, each one pushing his body beyond what should have been possible. They implanted a second heart, extra lungs that could filter toxins, glands that produced acids and stimulants, bones that were reinforced with ceramite compounds, until they could turn aside blades that would shear through normal human bone. The pain was indescribable. Many aspirants died during the process, their bodies rejecting the changes or their minds breaking under the strain. Tiberius survived, though there were moments when he begged for death, when the agony was so intense that oblivion seemed preferable to one more second of consciousness. But he endured because the alternative was failure, and he had not survived the age of strife by being weak. When the transformation was complete, he was no longer fully human. He was taller, broader, stronger than any normal man. His muscles had density that defied physics. His bones could withstand impacts that would pulverize normal skeleton. His reaction time had been accelerated to the point where the world seemed to move in slow motion during combat. He could eat anything and derive nutrition from it, could go weeks without sleep, could survive in environments that would kill unaugmented humans in seconds. But more than the physical changes, it was the mental conditioning that set him apart. The hypno-indoctrination, the psycho-conditioning, the endless training that turned him from a soldier into a space marine. They taught him tactics and strategy that had been lost during the age of strife, weapon disciplines that dated back to humanity's first stellar empire, the unshakable loyalty to the emperor and his vision for humanity that would define everything he became. He served in the early unification wars, in campaigns whose names have been lost to history. He fought at the Battle of Mount Ararat, where the Thunder Warriors made their last stand against the forces they had helped to create. He was there when the Emperor's armies broke the fortress of Ursh, when the techno-barbarian kingdoms finally began to truly crumble. He saw the rise of the Imperium from its bloody beginning, watched as terror was slowly, painfully, dragged into a single unified polity for the first time in thousands of years. And through it all, he fought alongside the Emperor himself. Not in every battle, of course. The master of mankind could not be everywhere at once, even with his incomprehensible powers. But there were campaigns where he took personal command, where his golden armor blazed at the front of the armies like a second sun, where his psychic might tore through enemy forces with the ease of a blade through water. It was during the siege of the Ethnarch's stronghold that Tiberius first spoke directly with the emperor. The battle had been grinding on for weeks, the Ethnarch's forces using weapons from the dark age of technology that defied comprehension. Tiberius's squad had been pinned down in the ruins of what had once been a government building, caught between enemy fire and a collapsing structure that threatened to bury them all. He had expected to die there. It seemed like a worthy end, dying in service to the vision of a united humanity. But then the Emperor was there, standing in the midst of lass fire and plasma bursts as if they were nothing more than gentle rain, and his presence was like nothing Tiberius had ever experienced. Later, much later, Tiberius would try to describe that presence to others and find himself inadequate to the task. How do you explain what it felt like to stand near a being of such overwhelming power? It wasn't just the psychic might, though that was palpable enough, a pressure against the soul that made even space marines want to kneel. It was something deeper, a sense that you were in the presence of something that transcended normal human existence. The Emperor spoke to him then, as they fought together to extract Tiberius's squad from their impossible position. Not orders or tactical directives, though those came too. No, the Emperor spoke to him as one warrior to another, acknowledging his courage, asking about his brothers, treating him not as a mere tool, but as a person worthy of consideration. "Your name, warrior." The voice was unlike anything Tiberius had ever heard, seeming to resonate on frequencies beyond normal human hearing. "Tiberius, my lord, of the 3rd Cohort, 16th Company. Tiberius." The Emperor smiled, and it transformed his face from something alien and terrifying into something almost human. "You fought well today, Tiberius. Your Emperor is pleased." They made it out of that battle, all of them, though 2 brothers died of their wounds before the apothecaries could reach them. But Tiberius never forgot that conversation, brief as it was. He never forgot the way the Emperor had treated him as someone whose existence mattered, whose service was recognized and valued. There would be other encounters over the years of the Unification Wars. The Emperor would sometimes walk among his warriors between battles, speaking with them, learning about their concerns and dreams. Tiberius came to understand that this was part of how he maintained their loyalty, not through fear alone, though the Emperor could inspire terror when needed, but through this personal connection, this sense that they were not merely tools, but valued servants of a greater vision. When Tiberius fell at the Battle of Albia, his spine shattered by a proto-Dreadnought's power fist. When his brothers carried his broken body from the field, expecting him to die, it was the Emperor himself who made the decision. The technology to create true Dreadnoughts was still new, still being perfected. Only a handful existed, and choosing who would be granted this terrible honor was no small matter. But the Emperor remembered Tiberius, remembered a conversation in the midst of battle, remembered a warrior who had served with distinction through campaigns whose difficulty would not be matched until the heresy itself. And so Tiberius was given what he called a gift, and what Tiberius would later understand was both salvation and curse. The transformation from dying space marine to Dreadnought was agony that made his original transformation pale in comparison. They cut away everything that wasn't essential, reducing him to a brain, a few vital organs, little more than a consciousness in a shell of meat kept alive by machines. The neural interfaces felt like white-hot spikes driven into his brain. The first time they activated the Dreadnought chassis with him inside, he screamed for 3 hours straight, the sound echoing from his Vox speakers until the tech marines thought they had made a terrible mistake. But he adapted. He learned to think through the chassis' sensors, to move through its hydraulics and servos as if they were his own muscles, to accept that this metal coffin was now his body and would remain so for as long as he continued to serve. That was over 10,000 years ago. 10 millennia of service, of watching the Imperium rise and grow and slowly begin its long decline. 10,000 years of being awakened for battles, then returned to the cold dark of stasis sleep. 10,000 years of being a living bridge between the past and present, a witness to everything the Imperium has become. And now, awakened again in this chamber, ancient Tiberius prepares to do something he has never done in all those long years. He prepares to speak the truth about the Emperor he knew, the man behind the myth, the vision that has been so thoroughly corrupted that sometimes he wonders if it would have been better if the Unification Wars had never been won at all. But he will speak, because these young warriors deserve to know, because truth, however painful, is the only foundation on which genuine faith can be built. And because after 10,000 years of silence, of carefully guarded words and diplomatic evasions, he finds that he can no longer bear to watch the next generation stumble blindly in the dark. The memory of him. "Let me tell you about the Emperor as I knew him," ancient Tiberius begins, his Vox speakers carrying his words through the chamber with a clarity that seems to make the very air grow heavy. "And I must warn you again before I start. What I tell you will challenge everything you've been taught to believe." He pauses, his optical sensors sweeping across the assembled Marines, reading their body language, their minute reactions. These are not the first warriors he has told this story to, but it has been centuries since the last time, and each generation must learn anew. When you pray to the Emperor, what do you imagine? A golden god, radiant and perfect, whose will is beyond mortal comprehension, a being of pure light, untainted by the flaws that plague normal humans. That is what the ecclesiarchy teaches, what the sermons proclaim, what a billion believers across the galaxy hold in their hearts as truth. That is not who I met on the battlefields of terror. Brother Cassius leans forward, his earlier boldness replaced now by intense focus. Around him, the other Marines have gone absolutely still, drinking in every word. The Emperor was... Tiberius searches for the right words, and it's clear even through his mechanical voice that this is difficult, trying to encapsulate something so vast in mere language. He was overwhelming. There is no other word adequate to the task. When he was present, every person in the vicinity knew it. Not because he announced himself or demanded attention, but because reality itself seemed to bend around him, acknowledgement of his power made manifest. His appearance changed depending on who looked at him. I learned this by comparing notes with my brothers after battles where we had all seen him. To some, he appeared as the perfect warrior, all golden armor and blazing sword, the very avatar of martial prowess. To others, he seemed a wise scholar, his features reflecting deep understanding and ancient knowledge. To the tech marines and tech priests, he appeared as the ultimate fusion of man and machine, the omnissiah made flesh. For me, he always appeared as a general, not necessarily the largest or most imposing figure on the battlefield, but the one whose every gesture commanded instant obedience, whose tactical genius was written in the set of his shoulders and the way he surveyed the terrain. I think he appeared to each of us as what we needed him to be. What would inspire our absolute loyalty and trust? Chaplain Mordecai interrupts, his voice tight with something that might be concern or might be barely suppressed anger. Ancient One, you speak as if the Emperor deliberately deceived those who followed him. Deceived? Tiberius considers the word. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say he understood that truth is malleable, that what people see is often less important than what they believe they see. He presented different faces to different audiences, not out of malice, but out of practicality. How else do you unite a shattered world? How else do you forge 1 billion different peoples into a single Imperium? By being all things to all people, by showing each faction the face they needed to see to follow him. But beneath all those faces, there was a core identity, a person who existed independent of the masks. And that person was... He pauses again, longer this time. Complex, contradictory, human, despite his immense power. Human? Brother Cassius sounds shocked. But the Emperor is... I said human, and I meant it. Not limited, not weak, but possessing the essential qualities that define humanity. Ambition, determination, the capacity for both great compassion and terrible cruelty. He loved us. I believe that absolutely. He loved humanity with a passion that drove him to shape the entire galaxy according to his vision of what we could become. But it was the love of a father who knows better than his children, who is willing to make them suffer if it serves their ultimate good. Tiberius shifts his stance, his weapon systems powered down, but his presence somehow even more commanding than when they were active. I remember one conversation in particular, after the Battle of Mount Ararat, where the Thunder Warriors were destroyed. I had the misfortune to be nearby when he spoke with one of his custodians about the decision. I was meant to be in stasis sleep, my damaged systems being repaired, but something in my chassis had failed, and I remained partially conscious. The custodian asked him if he regretted the necessity of what had been done. The Thunder Warriors had been his first superhuman soldiers, the weapons that had won him terror. But they were flawed, unstable, and unsuited for the longer campaign he envisioned. So he had ordered them killed, all of them, in a single night of betrayal that would have made even the traitors of the heresy pause in admiration at its ruthlessness. Do you know what he said? He told the custodian that regret was a luxury he could not afford. That every action he took, no matter how terrible, was weighed against the ultimate goal of humanity's survival. The Thunder Warriors had to die because they would have become a threat, a liability, a cancer that would have grown in the Imperium's heart. Their sacrifice, though they did not choose it, bought humanity its future. But then, Tiberius's voice drops lower, as if he's sharing a secret that even after all these years, feels dangerous to speak. But then, he said something that haunted me then and haunts me still. He said, "But I remember all their names. Every one. And when this is done, when humanity stands secure at last, I will mourn them as they deserved to be mourned." That was the Emperor I knew, a being capable of ordering mass murder for the greater good, but who carried the weight of those decisions with him, who remembered the names of those he sacrificed, who understood the cost of what he was building, even as he deemed that cost necessary and therefore acceptable. The chamber is silent, except for the soft hum of the Dreadnought systems. When Tiberius continues, his voice carries a note that might be sadness, though it's hard to tell through the mechanical vocalization. He was brilliant, more intelligent than any being I have ever encountered. His strategic mind could encompass entire campaigns, see connections and possibilities that remained invisible to even the most gifted of his generals. I watched him plan the conquest of the Pan-Pacific Empire in an afternoon, accounting for factors that would only become relevant months later, predicting enemy responses with accuracy that bordered on precognition. But he was also arrogant, not in the petty way of small men puffed up with undeserved pride, but in the way of someone who truly was superior to everything around him and knew it. He believed he alone understood what humanity needed, that only his vision could save us from extinction. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps in that age of darkness, humanity did need a tyrant of absolute conviction to drag it from the abyss. But that arrogance, that absolute certainty in his own correctness, it created blindness. He could not conceive that he might be wrong about important things, could not imagine that his sons, the Primarchs he had created, might see the world differently and that their perspective might have value. He dismissed concerns, ignored warnings, because he was so certain that his path was the only viable path. I saw this particularly in his dealings with Magnus the Red before the heresy. Magnus tried to warn him about Horus's corruption, tried to reach him through the warp to prevent the catastrophe that was coming. But the Emperor had forbidden Magnus from using his powers in that way, had decreed that the warp was too dangerous to be explored, even by those who thought they understood it. And when Magnus broke that prohibition, even to save the Imperium, the Emperor's response was immediate and terrible. He ordered Magnus's legion destroyed, sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero, with instructions that brooked no mercy. And when Russ hesitated, when the Wolf King tried to offer Magnus a chance to surrender and explain, it was Horus who twisted the orders, who ensured that the violence would be total and the bridges would be burned beyond repair. But the Emperor's initial reaction, the refusal to even consider that Magnus might have had good reason for his actions, that inflexibility was there in the original command. He saw disobedience where there had been desperate loyalty. He saw betrayal where there had been an attempt at salvation. And from that misunderstanding, from that failure to see beyond his own absolute certainty, came so much of the horror that followed. Brother Cassius speaks up, his voice careful. "Are you saying the heresy was the Emperor's fault?" "I'm saying that nothing in this universe is simple, and that blame is a poison that spreads to contaminate everything it touches. Horus chose corruption. Magnus chose to break his father's commands. Lorgar chose to seek gods in the warp, when the Emperor tried to teach him that gods were illusions. Each of them made choices, and each of them bears responsibility for those choices. But the Emperor made choices too. He chose to keep secrets from his sons, to hide the truth about chaos, even as he sent them to confront it. He chose to treat them as tools, rather than as the deeply complex beings he had created them to be. He chose to believe that he alone needed to understand the grand design, that everyone else could simply be given orders and would obey without question or doubt. And when that approach failed, when his sons proved to be more than simple weapons that could be pointed at a target, he had no backup plan, no way to adapt, no understanding of how to treat with them, as anything other than extensions of his will. Tiberius goes quiet for a long moment, and when he speaks again, there's something almost like affection in his mechanical voice. But for all his flaws, for all his terrible decisions, and his arrogance, and his willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything for his vision, he believed. He genuinely, passionately, completely believed that he was saving humanity, that every horror he inflicted was a necessary step on the path to our survival. And that belief, that absolute conviction, was intoxicating. When he spoke about his vision for humanity, about a galaxy where our species stood supreme and secure, where the warp was closed off and chaos could no longer touch us, where technology and reason had replaced superstition and faith, you believed too. You couldn't help it. His certainty became your certainty. His dreams became your dreams. I remember the night before we launched the attack on the last major fortress of the Nordafric conclaves. The Emperor walked among the assembled troops, and when he came to my unit, he stopped, looked at each of us in turn, and then he spoke, not as a god or even as a general, but as one warrior to others. He told us that what we were building was worth any sacrifice, that our grandchildren's grandchildren would live in a galaxy where humanity flourished from one end to the other, where no child would grow up as we had, in fear and starvation and endless war. He told us that we were the foundation upon which that future would be built, and that our service would be remembered and honored for all time. It was a lie, of course, or at least, it didn't come true in the way he promised. The galaxy we built is not the paradise he envisioned. Our descendants do not live free from fear or war or suffering, and we are not remembered as he said we would be, not really. We're legends now, myths, stories told to new recruits that have been edited and sanitized until they bear little resemblance to the truth. But in that moment, when he stood before us and painted that picture of the future, we would have walked into hell itself if he had asked it of us, because he made us believe, because his vision was beautiful, and we were so tired of the ugliness that the galaxy had become. That was the Emperor's true power, I think. Not his psychic might, though that was formidable. Not his strategic genius, though that was unmatched. His true power was the ability to make you believe that the impossible was achievable, that the dream was worth the nightmare, that the ends truly did justify any means. And the terrible thing is, Tiberius concludes, his voice heavy with something that might be regret, I still believe it. After 10,000 years, after watching his dream curdle into this imperium of faith and fear, after seeing how far we've fallen from what he wanted us to become, I still believe that he was right, that humanity needed him, needed his vision, needed his terrible certainty, and his willingness to do whatever was necessary. I just wish he had understood that belief and faith are not the same thing, that loyalty given freely is stronger than loyalty taken by force, that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. He taught us to follow him without question, and when he fell, when he was no longer there to guide us, we didn't know how to question. We only knew how to follow. And so, we followed the ones who claimed to speak in his name. And the Imperium he built to last forever began its slow descent into the darkness from which he had tried to save us. The long sleep. To understand what ancient Tiberius has endured, you must understand what it means to be a dreadnought across the span of millennia. It is not merely a matter of time passing, though the sheer weight of years would crush a normal human consciousness into dust. It is the way time passes for one entombed in adamantium and ceramite, the strange distortion that occurs when you live a handful of days and then sleep for decades, when you wake to find that the galaxy has moved on without you. Between each awakening lies the void. The tech marines call it stasis sleep, but Tiberius knows it as something deeper and more terrible. It is not the rest that living beings experience, where dreams carry consciousness to strange shores, and the mind processes the events of waking life. It is a cessation so complete that when consciousness returns, there is always a moment of absolute confusion, a vertigo of existence where he cannot remember who or what he is. Sometimes the return is gentle, a gradual increase in sensation as his neural pathways reconnect with the Dreadnought's systems. He feels the amniotic fluid first, thick and cold against the remnants of his flesh. Then comes awareness of the neural interfaces, the jack points where his nervous system meets the machine. Sensation that is neither pain nor pleasure, but something foreign to categories designed for human experience. Sound filters in next, usually the binaric chanting of tech marines performing the awakening rites, their voices modulated into machine code prayers that speak directly to his auditory implants. Other times, the return is violent. Emergency awakening protocols, used when the chapter faces threats so dire that they cannot wait for the standard ceremonies. Then he surges back into consciousness, like a drowning man breaking the surface of water, every system screaming online simultaneously, tactical data flooding his awareness before he's even fully oriented to which century he's awakened into. Those are the worst wakings, when the confused seconds between sleep and waking combat readiness stretch into eternity, when his mind grasps desperately for context that his systems haven't yet provided. But regardless of how he awakens, there is always the moment when he must confront what he has become, when he tries to move a hand and remembers that he has no hands, only the articulated weapons that serve in their place, when he tries to breathe and finds only the cycling of life support systems, the oxygenation of amniotic fluid that sustains the small island of flesh that remains of his original body, when he tries to speak and hears instead the mechanical rasp of vox speakers, his thoughts translated into sound by systems that reduce the infinite nuance of human voice to crude approximations. The first few centuries after his internment, Tiberius fought against this reality. Every awakening was a fresh horror, a renewed confrontation with the fact that he would never again feel sunlight on skin, would never taste food, would never experience the simple pleasure of walking without the thunder of his tread shaking the ground. He would rage against the restraints of his sarcophagus, trying to break free, trying to escape the metal tomb that had become his eternal prison. The tech marines and chaplains were patient with him in those early days. They understood that the transition from flesh to machine was traumatic, that even a space marine's psychological conditioning could not entirely prepare a warrior for the reality of Dreadnought existence. They would talk him through the episodes, remind him of his duty, of the honor he had been granted, of the necessity of his continued service. Gradually, over the decades that became centuries, he learned acceptance. Not peace, not contentment, but a grim understanding that this was his existence now, and raging against it accomplished nothing. He learned to focus on the moments of waking, on the battles where his service mattered, where the massive firepower and durability of his Dreadnought chassis turned the tide and saved brothers who would otherwise have fallen. But acceptance brought with it a different kind of suffering, because once he stopped fighting against what he had become, he began to notice what he was losing with each awakening. The first thing to fade was the sense of continuity. In his early awakenings, he could remember with perfect clarity everything that had happened since his internment. Each battle was distinct in his memory, each conversation preserved in detail that his enhanced space marine cognition made possible. But as the centuries accumulated, as the number of awakenings grew, those memories began to blur together. Battles merged into a single, endless campaign. Faces of brothers he had known became indistinct, their features smoothing into generic representations of space marines rather than distinct individuals. Events that had seemed momentous at the time, victories or defeats that had shaped the course of campaigns, reduced to brief tactical notes in his consciousness, the emotional content leached away by time and the mechanical nature of his existence. He realized with growing horror that he was forgetting his original life. The details of his childhood, which had once been preserved with crystalline clarity despite the centuries since he had lived them, began to slip away. He could no longer remember his mother's face, could only recall that she had existed, that she had mattered to him. His father became an abstract concept rather than a person, a role rather than an individual with quirks and characteristics that had once defined him. Even his original name became uncertain. Had he always been Tiberius? Or had that been a designation given to him during his transformation into a space marine, replacing whatever name his parents had bestowed? He could no longer remember with certainty, and there were no records from that early period that survived to settle the question. The age of strife had consumed most documentation, and what little remained focused on the grand sweep of history rather than the personal details of individual soldiers. With each awakening, he would check himself, an internal inventory of memory, to see what remained. His service during the Unification Wars was mostly intact, though gaps had appeared even there. He remembered the Emperor, remembered their conversations and his presence, though even those memories had begun to take on a mythic quality that concerned him. Was he remembering truly, or was he remembering his previous rememberings, each iteration losing a bit more fidelity, until what remained was more reconstruction than recollection? The Great Crusade existed in his memory as a series of disconnected battles. He had been there, had fought on a dozen worlds whose names meant nothing to him now, had watched the Imperium spread across the galaxy like a tsunami of ceramite and bolter fire. But the details, the brothers he had served with, the specific victories and defeats that had shaped 2 centuries of expansion, gone, or so fragmentary that they felt more like dreams than memories. The Horus heresy was clearer, because trauma burns itself into memory in ways that joy and routine cannot match. He remembered Istvan, though he had not been there for the drop site massacre. He remembered the agonizing years when brother fought brother, when the Imperium tore itself apart, when it became clear that the Emperor's vision had failed in ways that could never be fully repaired. He remembered the siege of Terra, the desperate defense of the Imperial Palace, the moment when word spread that the Emperor had fallen, that he had been interred in the Golden Throne, that he would never walk among them again. That was the day Tiberius understood that his existence would never end. The Emperor could no longer decree that he had served long enough, could no longer grant him the release of final death. The chapter needed every dreadnought they could maintain, every ancient warrior who could still fight. And so he would continue, awakening and sleeping, until some battle finally destroyed him completely, or the Imperium itself fell into dust. Between awakenings, there were the dreams, or what passed for dreams, in a mind partially merged with machine systems. They were not the random firing of neurons that characterized human dreaming, but something else, something that might have been his consciousness trying to process existence, or might have been artifacts of the neural interface struggling to maintain continuity during the long periods of stasis. In these not dreams, he walked through the corridors of the fortress monastery, but it was never the monastery as it truly was. Instead, it was a fusion of every version he had ever known, walls that shifted between ancient stone and modern ceramite, chambers that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. He would encounter brothers he had known, but they would speak with voices that belonged to different people, their faces morphing from one individual to another, as if his memory could not decide which of the thousands of warriors he had served with was truly present. Sometimes the Emperor appeared in these dreams, but he was different from the being Tiberius had known. In the dreams, the Emperor was distant, unreachable, speaking in riddles that Tiberius could never quite decipher. Or he would be accusing, demanding to know why Tiberius had allowed his dream to fail, why the Imperium had become this twisted shadow of his vision. Or he would be silent, simply looking at Tiberius with an expression of profound sadness, as if mourning what his loyal servant had become. Tiberius would wake from these dreams confused and disoriented, unable to distinguish what had been memory and what had been fantasy, what had truly occurred during his service and what his deteriorating mind had constructed to fill the growing voids in his recollection. The tech marines assured him that this was normal, that all dreadnoughts experienced similar phenomena as the centuries accumulated. But their assurances did little to comfort him, because he could feel himself slipping away. Not his consciousness, not yet, but his self. The person he had once been was dying by degrees, replaced by something that was more machine than man, more weapon than warrior. He could trace the progression through his own thoughts, notice how his reactions had changed over the millennia. In his first centuries as a dreadnought, he had mourned each fallen brother, had felt genuine grief when warriors he knew were killed in battle. Now, when Marines died, he processed it as tactical data, noting the loss and adjusting his strategic calculations accordingly, but feeling nothing of the emotional weight that should accompany death. He told himself it was because he had seen so much death, that no mind could maintain that level of emotional engagement after 10,000 years of war. But he suspected the truth was darker, that his capacity for emotion itself was eroding, victim to the mechanical nature of his existence. He found himself thinking in tactical terms, even when tactics were inappropriate. A chaplain would speak to him about faith and duty, and his mind would be analyzing the most efficient firing solutions for his weapons systems. A chapter master would ask for his counsel on matters of strategy, and he would provide answers that were tactically sound, but which failed to account for the human elements that might have influenced his thinking in earlier centuries. Most disturbing of all was the way his perception of time had changed. In his flesh and blood days, time had been linear, a river that flowed steadily from past to present to future. Now, time felt like a series of isolated pools, each awakening a discrete event with only tenuous connections to what came before and what would come after. He would wake to find that 50 years had passed, but those 50 years had no substance for him, were simply a gap in his experience, a void between periods of consciousness. And with that fragmentary perception of time came a fragmentary perception of self. Who was Tiberius? Was he the sum of all his awakenings, each one a separate version of himself that happened to share the same name and general memories? Or was he some continuous entity that persisted through the void of stasis sleep, maintaining coherent identity despite the years of nothingness? He no longer knew the answer, and that uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his existence. Because if he could not define who he was, if his self had become this scattered collection of intermittent consciousness, then what was it that he was preserving through his continued service? What was the point of endurance? If the thing enduring had no stable identity, no continuous experience, no way to meaningfully connect the warrior who had first been interred with the consciousness that currently inhabited this chassis. These were the thoughts that plagued him during the rare moments when he allowed himself to truly consider his existence. Most of the time, he pushed such considerations aside, focused on his duty, on the tactical requirements of whatever battle he had been awakened to fight. It was easier that way, simpler to be the weapon that the chapter needed, rather than the person who questioned what that weaponization had cost. But the questions remained, lurking in the background of his consciousness, waiting for moments of stillness to resurface. And with each awakening, those questions grew more insistent, more difficult to dismiss, because he could feel the end of something approaching, even if he couldn't clearly articulate what that end would be. Perhaps it would be the complete erosion of his personality, the final transition from person to pure machine. Perhaps it would be madness, the kind that afflicted some dreadnoughts who were awakened too frequently or kept conscious too long, their minds breaking under the strain of existence divorced from flesh. Perhaps it would be the heat death of memory, when so much had been forgotten that he could no longer remember why he served or what he had once been, when nothing remained but bare functionality and the mechanical execution of orders. Or perhaps, and this thought brought something close to hope, it would be final death in battle, the destruction of his chassis and the release of whatever remained of his consciousness into whatever lay beyond. At least that would be an end, a cessation that came with purpose, a final service rendered before the eternal darkness closed in. Until then, he would endure, because that was what he had been created to do, because the chapter needed him, because the Emperor, whatever he had become in his 10,000-year vigil on the Golden Throne, had asked this of him all those centuries ago on the battlefields of terror. But the cost of that endurance was higher than anyone who had not experienced it could truly comprehend. And sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, Tiberius wondered if perhaps the Thunder Warriors had been the fortunate ones after all, granted death before they could learn what eternity truly meant. Why now? The breaking of silence. For 97 centuries, ancient Tiberius has been circumspect in his testimony. When awakened, he has provided tactical counsel, shared his knowledge of ancient warfare and enemy behaviors, recounted battles from the Imperium's early days when asked. But he has always been careful, always diplomatic, always aware that what he knows and what the Imperium believes are not always compatible. He has watched generation after generation of space marines kneel before him, seeking wisdom from one who fought alongside the Emperor. And he has given them wisdom, true enough, but carefully curated, sanded down to remove the sharp edges that might cut too deeply, that might challenge the faith that holds the Imperium together. He has played the role expected of him, the ancient hero, the living link to glory days, the embodiment of everything the Adeptus Astartes aspires to become. But there are limits to silence. There are moments when the weight of unspoken truth becomes unbearable, when the gap between what is believed and what is real grows so vast that maintaining the pretense feels like its own form of betrayal. This is such a moment. The chapter stands at a crossroads, though most of its warriors don't yet fully comprehend it. On the surface, the crisis appears tactical, a matter of enemies pressing from multiple fronts, of resources stretched thin, of decisions that must be made about how to deploy limited forces against overwhelming threats. But Tiberius can see deeper, can recognize patterns that his 10,000 years of service have made painfully familiar. The chapter is experiencing a crisis of faith. It began subtly, as such things always do. A few Marines questioning the orders they received from their chaplains, wondering why prayers seemed more important than proper tactical preparation. Debates in the halls about whether faith in the Emperor was sufficient protection, or whether they needed to rely more heavily on their training and equipment. Brothers who had survived impossible situations by what they attributed to divine intervention, clashing with brothers who believed that luck and skill had saved them. These tensions had always existed to some degree. The balance between faith and pragmatism has been a defining characteristic of the Space Marines since the earliest days of the Imperium. But recently, that balance had begun to tip in dangerous ways. The chapter master has been pushing harder toward religious observance, influenced by advisors from the ecclesiarchy who have insinuated themselves into the fortress monastery's halls. More prayer ceremonies, more hours spent in meditation on the Emperor's divinity, less time allocated to tactical drills and weapons training. The master argues that spiritual strength is the foundation of physical strength, that faith in the Emperor will sustain them when material resources fail. But not all the brothers agree. There is a faction, smaller but growing, that remembers the Space Marines were created as warriors first, as implements of the Emperor's will rather than worshippers of his divinity. They point to declining combat effectiveness, to battles that should have been won but were instead nearly lost because Marines spent more time praying than preparing. They argue that the Emperor would be disgusted by what his Imperium has become, that he would see the worship of his name as exactly the kind of superstitious thinking he tried to eradicate during the Unification Wars. Brother, Cassius belongs to this faction. His question earlier about needing to know the truth was not merely personal curiosity. It was a cry for help from a warrior who sees his chapter tearing itself apart over questions that should have simple answers, but which instead have grown impossibly complex over the millennia. And Tiberius recognizes the danger. He has seen this pattern before, in other chapters, in other eras. He has watched as disagreements about faith and doctrine metastasized into schisms that could not be healed, as warriors who should have been brothers instead became enemies divided by interpretation of the Emperor's will. He has seen chapters reduced to shadows of themselves, their strength wasted in internal conflicts, while external threats went unchallenged. He will not allow that to happen here. Not if he can prevent it. Not when he carries within his memory the knowledge that could settle this question, that could provide the foundation for genuine unity rather than the brittle facade of forced agreement. But to speak that knowledge is to risk everything, because what he knows contradicts the entire edifice of faith upon which the modern Imperium is built. The Emperor was not a god. He did not want to be worshipped. He built the Imperium on a foundation of reason and science specifically to eradicate the kind of religious thinking that now dominates every aspect of imperial life. If Tiberius speaks honestly about what the Emperor believed, about what he taught to those who fought at his side during the Unification Wars, he risks being declared a heretic. Never mind that he knew the Emperor personally, that his memories stretch back to the very founding of the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy will not tolerate challenges to their doctrine, and they wield enough power that even a chapter of Space Marines must consider their reactions carefully. But worse than the risk to himself, worse than the possibility of being declared tainted or corrupt, or compromised by the long years in the sarcophagus, is the risk to these warriors before him. If they learn the truth, if they understand how far the Imperium has strayed from the Emperor's vision, what will they do with that knowledge? Will it strengthen them, give them the clarity they need to navigate the impossible circumstances of the 41st millennium? Or will it break them, destroy the faith that has sustained them through battles that reason alone could never justify? Tiberius doesn't know. And that uncertainty has kept him silent through so many awakenings, through so many moments when he could have spoken, but chose instead to maintain his careful neutrality. But now, looking at these assembled Marines, seeing the desperation in their postures, the need in their eyes, he understands that silence is no longer acceptable. They deserve to know. They deserve to make their own choices about what to believe, armed with truth rather than propaganda, with history rather than mythology. And perhaps, just perhaps, they are strong enough to handle it. These are Space Marines, after all, warriors who have endured trials that would break normal humans. If anyone can confront the gap between faith and history and emerge intact, it will be them. So Tiberius makes his decision, not the careful political choice he has made in previous awakenings, but the choice that his conscience, eroded though it may be by centuries in the sarcophagus, demands that he make. He will tell them everything, not the sanitized version, not the carefully edited account that preserves comfortable illusions. The truth, complete and unvarnished, about the Emperor he knew, about the vision that drove the Unification Wars, about the Imperium as it was meant to be versus the Imperium as it became. And he will let them decide what to do with that knowledge. "I have been silent too long," he says, his vox speakers carrying the weight of his decision. "I have watched the Imperium drift further from what it was meant to be, and I have said nothing. I have seen the Emperor's vision corrupted into something he would have destroyed, and I have held my tongue. I have been, in my own way, complicit in the great deception. No more. You asked for truth, Brother Cassius, and I will give it to you, all of it, the good and the terrible, the inspiring and the damning. And when I am done, you will understand why I have been reluctant to speak, why this knowledge is both gift and burden." He pauses, gathering himself for what comes next. "But before I continue, I must make something absolutely clear. What I am about to tell you is not heresy, though the ecclesiarchy would certainly name it as such. It is not betrayal, though some will interpret it that way. It is simply the truth, as I lived it, as I witnessed it, as I carry it still in the fragments of memory that remain to me after 10,000 years. You are Space Marines. You are warriors who have sworn oaths to serve the Emperor and protect humanity. Nothing I tell you will change those oaths or diminish their importance. But understanding who the Emperor truly was, what he truly believed, might change how you fulfill those oaths. And that change, I believe, is what this moment demands. So I will speak, and may the Emperor, wherever his consciousness dwells now, forgive me if I am wrong to break the silence I have maintained for so long. The Emperor, as he was. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped, Tiberius begins, and the words fall into the chamber like stones into still water, their impact rippling outward. Let me say that again, because it is the foundational truth upon which everything else rests. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. He did not see himself as a god. He did not desire temples or prayers or the endless liturgies that now consume so much of the Imperium's energy. In fact, he actively despised such things. I was present at the destruction of the last church on Terra, the final holdout of organized religion during the Unification Wars. The Emperor himself oversaw its demolition, and before the charges were set, he spoke with the priest who had maintained it. I was far enough away that I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw the priest weeping as the Emperor spoke, saw him finally nod, in what looked like understanding or resignation. Later, I learned what the Emperor had told him, that humanity's dependence on gods and divine intervention had always been our greatest weakness, that every prayer offered to invisible powers was effort that could have been spent improving real conditions. That faith was a crutch that prevented humanity from standing on its own, from accepting responsibility for its own fate. He called it the imperial truth, this philosophy. He wanted to spread across the galaxy. It was uncompromising in its atheism, in its rejection of anything that could not be measured, proven, understood through reason and observation. He believed that humanity would never reach its true potential until it abandoned all forms of supernatural thinking, until it understood that there were no gods watching over us, no divine plans to follow, no cosmic justice to reward the faithful. Chaplain Mordecai's voice cuts through the chamber, harsh and disbelieving. Blasphemy! The Emperor is the God Emperor, the only true deity, the being who is currently entombed in the Golden Throne is many things, Tiberius interrupts, his voice carrying an authority that makes even the chaplain pause. He is powerful beyond mortal comprehension. He sustains the Astronomicon and holds back the warp with his psychic might. He may, for all I know, have ascended to something approaching true divinity during his 10,000 years on the throne. But the man I knew, the warlord who united Terra and launched the Great Crusade, was not a god and did not want to be called one. Do you understand what this means? The entire imperial cult, the ecclesiarchy that wields such power across the galaxy, the countless billions who pray daily to the Emperor as their savior and protector, all of it would have horrified him. The very thing he tried to prevent, the worship and deification that he spent centuries trying to eradicate from human culture, has become the defining characteristic of the Imperium built in his name. Brother Cassius leans forward, his voice urgent. But why? If he didn't want worship, what did he want from us? He wanted us to be worthy of survival, Tiberius responds. He looked at humanity, scattered and dying, torn apart by internal conflicts and external threats, our greatest achievements from the dark age of technology lost or corrupted, and he saw a species on the brink of extinction. He believed that only unity could save us, that only a single guiding intelligence with the wisdom and power to enforce his vision could drag humanity back from the abyss. He didn't want our worship. He wanted our loyalty. He wanted our obedience. He wanted us to trust that he knew better than we did what was needed for our survival, and to follow his directives without question or hesitation. Not because he was divine, but because he was supremely competent. Think about what that means. The Emperor saw himself as a leader, a general, a visionary, whose understanding and capabilities far exceeded those of normal humans. He believed he was right, that his path was the correct one, not because he was God, but because he had spent 40,000 years studying humanity, understanding its patterns and failures, preparing for the moment when he would finally guide us to security. It was pragmatic, utilitarian. He made decisions based on calculated assessments of what would serve humanity's long-term survival, not on moral considerations or spiritual values. The Thunder Warrior's extermination, necessary to prevent future instability. The secrecy around chaos, essential to prevent corruption. The authoritarian structure of the Imperium, required to maintain unity across millions of worlds. And for a time, it worked. Terror was unified. The Great Crusade spread across the galaxy, reclaiming lost human worlds at a rate that staggers comprehension. The Imperium grew, and humanity flourished in ways it hadn't since before the Age of Strife. Whatever else you might say about his methods, they achieved results. But there was a fundamental flaw in his approach, a blind spot that would ultimately prove catastrophic. He assumed that everyone else would think as he did, that reason and logic would be sufficient to bind people to his vision. He didn't understand faith, not really, because he had never needed it. His certainty came from knowledge and power, not from belief in something beyond proof. This is why he failed with Lorgar. The Word-Bearer's Primarch was a true believer, someone whose entire being required faith in something greater than himself. When Lorgar began to worship the Emperor as a god, when his legions spent more time building temples than prosecuting the crusade, the Emperor's response was terrible and swift. He ordered the destruction of Monarchia, the perfect city Lorgar had built as a monument to the Emperor's divinity. He humiliated Lorgar before his entire legion, made him and his sons kneel in the ruins, while he explained that this was not what he wanted, that worship was antithetical to everything he was trying to build. What the Emperor didn't understand was that you cannot extinguish faith through humiliation. You cannot reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. Lorgar needed to believe in something, and if he couldn't believe in the Emperor as God, he would find other gods to worship. And he did, to the Imperium's eternal sorrow. But here is where it becomes complicated, where the simple narratives break down and we must confront uncomfortable truths. Because while the Emperor rejected worship, while he despised religion and fought to eradicate it, he was not wrong about everything. The dangers he warned against, the threats he tried to protect us from, they were real. The warp is real. Chaos is real. The entities that dwell in the Imperium, hungry and malevolent, waiting for any opportunity to corrupt and destroy, they exist, and they are every bit as terrible as he knew them to be. His decision to hide the truth about chaos from his sons, from his armies, from humanity at large, it came from genuine concern. He had seen what happened when humans confronted chaos without preparation, had watched entire civilizations fall into darkness because they dabbled in powers they couldn't control. So he tried to shield us, tried to create an Imperium where humanity would never encounter these threats, because we would never look for them, never acknowledge their existence, never give them the foothold that attention and belief provides. It was, in his mind, the only way to keep us safe. Was he wrong? I don't know. Perhaps if his plan had succeeded, if the Great Crusade had completed its mission and the Webway project had closed off the warp entirely, perhaps then his strategy would have worked. We would have been protected by ignorance, safe because we never understood the true dangers lurking in the spaces between reality. But his plan didn't succeed. Magnus breached the Webway trying to warn about Horus. The heresy shattered the Imperium's unity. And in the aftermath, humanity was exposed to chaos anyway, without the preparation or understanding that might have helped us resist it. And so the Imperium adapted, not in the way the Emperor would have wanted, but in the way humans have always adapted to cosmic horror, through faith, through belief in the Emperor as protector and deity, through prayers and rituals and all the trappings of religion that he had tried to eliminate. Because it turns out that faith is one of the few weapons that works against chaos, that belief in the Emperor's protection does provide some measure of defense against corruption. The bitter irony is that the Emperor's deification, the worship he would have found abhorrent, may be the thing that has kept the Imperium functional for 10,000 years. The faith he tried to destroy has become the foundation of humanity's survival. And I suspect that if he could see what we've become, if his consciousness on the Golden Throne is aware of the Imperium as it currently exists, he would be torn between revulsion at how his vision was corrupted and grim acknowledgement that this twisted version has at least kept humanity alive. Tiberius falls silent, letting his words sink in. When he continues, his voice is quieter, more contemplative. So, what are we to make of this? How do we reconcile the emperor as he was with the emperor as he has become? How do we serve his true vision when that vision proved insufficient for the galaxy we actually inhabit? I don't have perfect answers. I am a warrior, not a philosopher. I can tell you what he believed, what he taught, what he tried to build. But I cannot tell you whether maintaining faith in his divinity or returning to his atheistic vision is the correct path forward. Both have their merits. Both have their dangers. What I can tell you is this: he believed in humanity. Absolutely, completely, without reservation. Every terrible thing he did, every atrocity he ordered, every sacrifice he demanded, all of it came from this core certainty that humanity was worth saving, worth protecting, worth guiding toward a future where we could stand secure against any threat. Whether he was God or man, whether he was right or wrong in his methods, that belief remains true. The emperor loved humanity. And if we can hold to that truth, if we can let it guide us as we navigate the impossible complexities of the 41st millennium, then perhaps we can find our way forward. Not by blindly following what the ecclesiarchy teaches, not by rejecting all faith in favor of pure rationalism, but by asking ourselves, in each moment of decision, in each choice we make, what serves humanity? What protects our species and drives us towards survival? That was the emperor's true gift to us. Not divinity, not perfect knowledge, but an example of absolute dedication to human survival, and the understanding that serving that goal might require things we would rather not do, might demand compromises with our ideals, might force us to make choices that have no good options, only less terrible ones. That is who he was. That is what he believed. And that is the legacy he left us to carry forward, whether we call him emperor or God or something else entirely. The weight of 10 millennia. To truly understand what ancient Tiberius carries, you must comprehend not just the length of his service, but its nature. 10,000 years is not merely a number. It is the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of cultures, the slow transformation of everything familiar into something alien. He has watched the Imperium change in ways both subtle and profound. The straightforward military hierarchy he knew during the Unification Wars has metastasized into a bureaucratic nightmare of overlapping authorities and competing power structures. Where once the emperor's word was law, now a dozen different factions claim to speak with his authority, from the High Lords of Terror to the ecclesiarchy to the Inquisition, each pursuing their own interpretation of what the emperor would want. The Space Marines themselves have changed, though perhaps not as dramatically as the Imperium around them. They are still warriors, still dedicated to duty and service, but the context in which they operate has shifted in fundamental ways. Where Tiberius fought with clarity of purpose, knowing exactly what the emperor demanded and why, modern Space Marines must navigate a complex web of traditions, regulations, and contradictory orders from various imperial authorities. He has seen the decline, watched as knowledge that was once commonplace became rare, as technology that was once understood became ritualized mystery. The tech priests who maintain his chassis perform ceremonies they no longer fully comprehend, following procedures passed down through generations without understanding the principles that underpin them. They know that certain oils must be applied in certain patterns, that specific prayers must be chanted while activating particular systems, but they have lost the engineering knowledge that would let them truly repair or improve his design. This decline isn't limited to technology. Tactical doctrine has ossified into rigid traditions. The Codex Astartes, which Guilliman intended as a flexible framework for organizing and deploying Space Marine forces, has become holy writ in many chapters, followed with religious devotion even when circumstances demand adaptation. Brothers argue about the proper interpretation of ancient passages rather than focusing on the immediate tactical situation. and always, everywhere, is the corruption. Not the taint of chaos, though that too has spread further than the Emperor ever anticipated, but the mundane corruption of power exercised without oversight, of authority wielded for personal benefit, rather than the greater good. He has seen planetary governors turn worlds into personal fiefdoms. He has watched inquisitors destroy populations to cover their own failures. He has witnessed Space Marine chapters fall into petty rivalries that cost countless lives for nothing more than pride and ancient grudges. The faith that now dominates Imperial life would have been unrecognizable to the warriors of the Unification Wars. They fought for a rational Imperium, a secular society built on reason and science. What exists now is the opposite, an empire where faith is the currency of power, where superstition determines policy, where the ecclesiarchy wields influence that rivals the administratum itself. Tiberius has watched the ecclesiarchy grow from a fringe cult worshipping the fallen emperor into one of the Imperium's most powerful institutions. He has seen the evolution of imperial religious practice from simple prayer to elaborate ceremonial displays that consume entire planetary economies. He has witnessed the persecution of those deemed heretical for nothing more than asking questions, for daring to think differently from approved doctrine. And he has watched the Space Marines accommodate all of this, where once they would have rejected religious authority as antithetical to their purpose. Now many chapters maintain close relationships with the ecclesiarchy. Chaplains who once focused on maintaining discipline and morale now spend much of their time leading religious services. Warriors who once defined themselves by their martial prowess now measure their worth partly by the strength of their faith. The cost of this transformation has been severe. The Imperium the Emperor tried to build was meant to be efficient, logical, capable of making decisions based on rational assessment of circumstances. What exists now is neither. Decisions are made based on religious doctrine, political considerations, ancient grudges, and bureaucratic inertia. The machinery of imperial governance groans under the weight of its own complexity, unable to respond effectively to threats that should be manageable. And yet somehow, it endures. This should not be possible. By every rational measure, the Imperium should have collapsed centuries ago under the weight of its own dysfunction. The fact that it hasn't, that humanity continues to hold its scattered empire together despite everything working against unity, suggests that perhaps there is something to the faith that binds it. Perhaps belief in the Emperor, irrational though it may be by the standards of the imperial truth, provides something that pure reason cannot. This is what Tiberius has wrestled with through his 10,000 years of service. The evidence of his senses tells him that the Emperor's vision has failed, that everything he tried to build has been corrupted into something he would have despised. But the evidence of history tells him that this corrupted version works better than logic suggests it should, that faith, for all its irrationality, provides a foundation for unity that reason alone has never achieved. He has tried to reconcile these observations, to understand what it means that the Emperor was both right and catastrophically wrong. Right that humanity needed unity, needed strength, needed protection from threats, both internal and external. Wrong that reason alone could provide these things, that humans could be convinced through logic to accept the harsh measures necessary for survival. Perhaps the truth is that humans need both. Need the rational framework of organization and technology to function effectively, but also need the irrational bonds of shared belief to maintain cohesion across the vast distances and diverse populations of a galactic empire. The Emperor provided the framework, but rejected the bonds, and in his absence, humanity has added the bonds, whether he would have wanted them or not. Tiberius has also watched individual humans over the centuries, observed how they navigate the impossible circumstances of imperial life. He has seen saints and monsters, heroes and cowards, brilliant minds and hopeless fools. But mostly, he has seen ordinary people doing their best in a galaxy that seems designed to crush them. There was a tech priest, centuries ago, who spent 3 years painstakingly restoring Tiberius's damaged sensory systems, after a battle that had left him partially blind. The priest worked with dedication that went beyond duty, speaking to Tiberius during the long sessions about his hopes for his children, his pride in his work, his faith that the emperor watched over them all. When the work was finally complete, the priest had thanked Tiberius for the honor of serving one of the emperor's ancient warriors, as if the benefit had been his rather than Tiberius's. That priest had died in a plague outbreak 5 years later, one of millions lost to a disease that proper quarantine procedures could have contained if the local governor hadn't been too busy embezzling to maintain the health infrastructure. His children survived, joined the Adeptus Mechanicus in their turn, and probably never knew how much their father had sacrificed for his craft. That is the Imperium in miniature. Dedicated individuals doing their best, often achieving remarkable things despite the system rather than because of it, their efforts sometimes wasted by the stupidity or corruption of those above them. And all of it justified and sustained by faith in the emperor, by the belief that their service matters, that they contribute to something greater than themselves. Tiberius cannot bring himself to condemn that faith, even knowing what he knows about the emperor's true beliefs. Because for all the ways that faith has corrupted the Imperium's efficiency, it has also given meaning to countless lives that would otherwise be nothing but brief flashes of suffering before the darkness claims them. But he also cannot bring himself to embrace it fully, cannot make himself believe that the emperor's deification was right, or good, or what he would have wanted. The gap between what was intended and what exists is too vast, the corruption too obvious, the distance from the original vision too great. And so he exists in this uncomfortable middle ground, accepting the necessity of faith without believing in it himself, acknowledging its value while mourning what was lost when reason gave way to religious thinking. It is not a comfortable position, this intellectual and spiritual ambivalence, but it is the only honest stance he can take given everything he has witnessed. 10,000 years have taught Tiberius many things, but perhaps the most important is this: there are no simple answers in the 41st millennium. Every solution creates new problems. Every strength is also a weakness. Every triumph contains the seeds of future failure. The galaxy is too vast, too complex, too hostile for neat categories and clear moral distinctions. The emperor understood this, Tiberius thinks. He made terrible choices because terrible choices were all that were available. He accepted the cost of his actions because the alternative was extinction. He built an empire that would last for 10,000 years, despite being fundamentally flawed, because a flawed empire was better than no empire at all. And perhaps that is the real lesson, the true wisdom that Tiberius carries from his millennia of service. Not that there is a right path forward, but that the path forward requires accepting ambiguity, embracing contradiction, making the best choices possible, even when all options are terrible. The emperor was not perfect. The Imperium is not perfect. Faith is not perfect. Reason is not perfect. But somehow, cobbled together from all these imperfect elements, humanity endures. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. What he would think. You want to know what he would think, Tiberius says after a long pause, his optical sensors sweeping across the assembled Marines. What the Emperor would make of the Imperium as it currently exists, if his consciousness on the Golden Throne is aware enough to perceive what we have become. I see the question in your postures, in the way you lean forward, as if my words might provide the certainty you seek. The truth is, I don't know. I knew him for less than 2 centuries, during the most violent and transformative period of his existence. The being he was then, the warlord who unified terror through force and vision, may be utterly different from whatever he has become after 10,000 years entombed in the Golden Throne, his consciousness warped by millennia of exposure to the warp, his perspective changed by experiences I cannot imagine. But I can tell you what the Emperor I knew would think. And I warn you, the answer is not comforting. Brother Cassius speaks up, his voice steady despite the tension in the chamber. We don't need comfort, Ancient One. We need truth. Very well. The Emperor I knew would be horrified by the Imperium. Absolutely, completely horrified in ways that go beyond simple disappointment or frustration. He would see it as a comprehensive failure of everything he tried to accomplish, a perversion of his vision so complete that it might be worse than if Terra had never been unified at all. Start with the ecclesiarchy. He spent centuries trying to eradicate organized religion from Terra, burning temples, destroying churches, executing priests who refused to abandon their faith. He saw religion as humanity's greatest weakness, the thing that kept us from taking responsibility for our own fate. And now, the Imperium is built on the worship of him as God. Trillions of humans pray to him daily. Entire worlds are devoted to nothing but religious observance. The ecclesiarchy wields political power that rivals the administratum itself. Everything he fought against has been resurrected in his name. The superstition he tried to eliminate has become the foundation of imperial culture. The gods he tried to prove didn't exist have been replaced by worship of him as the one true God. From his perspective, this would be the ultimate betrayal, the triumph of everything he sought to destroy. Then there's the technological regression. The Emperor had access to knowledge from the dark age of technology. He understood the principles behind the machines he used. He built weapons and ships and systems through comprehension, not through ritual. He wanted humanity to reclaim the heights of its past achievements, to become once again a species of builders and innovators rather than users of machines they couldn't truly understand. Look at what we've become instead. The Adeptus Mechanicus treats technology as religious mystery, performing ceremonies to appease machine spirits rather than conducting repairs based on engineering principles. Ancient devices are maintained through ritual because the knowledge of how they actually work has been lost. We cannot build what our ancestors built, cannot improve on designs that are 10,000 years old, cannot even properly maintain some of our most critical systems. The Emperor would see this as inexcusable. He would demand to know how humanity squandered its knowledge, how we allowed ourselves to regress into technological superstition. He would be furious at the waste, at the potential that has been thrown away. And the Imperium's governance structure would appall him. He built a centralized command hierarchy because he believed that clear chains of authority and efficient decision-making were essential for human survival. What exists now is the opposite, a bureaucratic nightmare where dozens of different power centers compete for authority, where decisions require approval from multiple overlapping institutions, where the machinery of government is so complex that actually accomplishing anything requires navigating absurd levels of red tape. The High Lords of Terra barely speak to each other, often work at cross purposes, sometimes actively sabotage each other's initiatives because of political rivalries that go back centuries. The administratum is so bloated that simple decisions can take years to implement. The Inquisition operates with virtually no oversight, destroying entire worlds on the whim of individual inquisitors who may be insane, corrupt, or simply mistaken. This is not what the Emperor wanted. He wanted efficiency, wanted capable people making informed decisions quickly, wanted the Imperium to be able to respond to threats with the coordination and precision of a military force. What exists now is paralysis dressed up as procedure, incompetence rationalized as necessary complexity. Chaplain Mordecai's voice cuts in, defensive. But the Imperium endures, Ancient One. For 10,000 years, we have held the line against chaos, against the Xenos, against every threat that has emerged. Surely that counts for something. Surely the Emperor would see that his sacrifice was not in vain. Would he? Tiberius's response is immediate and sharp. Would he see the Imperium's endurance as success? Or would he see it as humanity clinging to existence by its fingernails, barely holding on despite having squandered every advantage he tried to give us? Consider what the Emperor's plan was meant to achieve. Not just survival, but security. Not just endurance, but triumph. He wanted humanity to be the dominant force in the galaxy, so powerful that no Xenos species would dare challenge us, so united that chaos could find no foothold, so technologically advanced that we could close off the warp entirely and never have to fear its influence again. None of that has happened. We haven't grown stronger over the last 10 millennia. We've grown weaker. Worlds that were once productive hives are now dead, their populations consumed by war or plague, or the endless grinding poverty of imperial life. Technology that was once common is now rare. Knowledge that was once widespread is now held by tiny handfuls of specialists who guard it jealously. We haven't dominated the galaxy. We share it with Xenos empires that are in some cases stronger than we are, with chaos forces that control vast swathes of territory, with threats that emerge from the void without warning and which we lack the strength to properly confront. The Great Crusade pushed out to the edges of the galaxy in 200 years. In the 10,000 years since, we haven't significantly expanded our borders. In many places, we've retreated. This is not triumph. This is decline. Slow, perhaps. Gradual enough that any single generation might not notice, but unmistakable when you have the perspective of millennia. The Imperium is dying, has been dying since the moment the Emperor fell, and everything we do now is merely forestalling the inevitable, rather than building towards something better. So when you ask me what the Emperor would think, when you wonder if he would approve of how we've carried on in his absence, I must answer honestly, no. He would not approve. He would be disappointed beyond measure, would see our faith as weakness and our traditions as chains, holding us back from the potential he tried to unlock. The chamber falls silent at this pronouncement. Tiberius can see the impact of his words in the way the Marines hold themselves, the way some seem to shrink, while others straighten as if preparing to argue. But, he continues, and the word hangs in the air like a promise, there is more to consider than simply what the Emperor would have wanted. Because the Emperor, for all his brilliance and power, was wrong about critical things. His vision for humanity, as perfect as it may have seemed, was inadequate for the galaxy we actually inhabit. He thought he could protect us from chaos through secrecy and denial, that if humanity simply didn't acknowledge the warp's dangers, if we remained ignorant of the entities that dwelt there, we would be safe. But that was naive. Chaos found us anyway, corrupted his sons anyway, shattered the Imperium anyway. And in the aftermath, we needed something he hadn't provided, a way to confront chaos, spiritually as well as materially. Faith, for all that he despised it, turned out to be one of the few effective weapons against chaos corruption. Belief in the Emperor's protection, irrational though it may be, provides genuine resistance to the whispers of the dark gods. The prayers that he would have found abhorrent actually help shield souls from damnation. The religious thinking he tried to eliminate has become one of our most important defenses. So while the Emperor might disapprove of what we've become, while he might see our faith as betrayal of his vision, the fact remains that without that faith, the Imperium probably would have fallen millennia ago. The worship he wouldn't have wanted may be the thing that has kept us alive. This creates an impossible paradox. We have betrayed the Emperor's vision in order to fulfill his ultimate goal, humanity's survival. We have embraced everything he fought against in order to maintain the Imperium he fought to create. We serve him best by disobeying his most fundamental commands. Tiberius shifts his stance, and his voice takes on a tone of finality. So what would the Emperor think? He would think we have failed. He would think we are weak, superstitious, inefficient, everything he tried to prevent us from becoming. He would be disappointed, angry, perhaps even disgusted by what his Imperium has become. And he would be wrong, because for all our failures, for all the ways we have corrupted his vision and betrayed his principles, we have accomplished the one thing that matters most. We have kept humanity alive. Battered, diminished, constantly on the edge of catastrophe, yes, but alive, still fighting, still holding the line against threats that would have destroyed species stronger and wiser than we are. The Emperor's vision failed, but humanity endures. And in the end, I think that is what truly matters. Not whether we live up to his standards, but whether we survive, not whether he would approve, but whether we fulfill his ultimate purpose, the preservation of our species against impossible odds. So serve the Emperor, but serve him not as the god he has become, and not as the tyrant he was. Serve him as the being who loved humanity enough to sacrifice everything for our survival. Honor his memory, not by trying to resurrect his vision, but by doing whatever is necessary, no matter how contradictory to his stated beliefs, to keep humanity alive for one more day, one more year, one more millennium. That is what I believe he would want, if he could see clearly, if he could think beyond the prison of his own certainty. Not perfect adherence to his plans, but creative adaptation in service of his goals. Not blind faith in his divinity, but clear-eyed commitment to human survival. And if I am wrong, if the Emperor truly would condemn us for what we have become, then so be it. Let him condemn us. We will endure his judgment as we have endured everything else, because we are human, and endurance is what we do best. Final testimony. The chamber has been silent for long moments since ancient Tiberius finished speaking. The Marines stand frozen, processing revelations that challenge everything they have been taught, that threaten the foundations of faith upon which they have built their identities. It is Brother Cassius who finally breaks the silence, his voice careful, as if he's testing the stability of ground that might give way beneath him. Ancient One, you have given us truth, and we honor you for it. But truth without direction is just chaos. We understand now who the Emperor was, what he wanted, and how far we have strayed. What we don't understand is what this means for us. How do we serve, knowing what we know? How do we fight, carrying this burden of truth? Tiberius considers the question, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of 10,000 years of contemplation. You serve as you always have, with courage, with discipline, with absolute dedication to humanity's survival. Nothing I have told you changes that fundamental duty. You are Space Marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, whether you see him as God or man, or something in between. That identity, that purpose, remains constant regardless of what you believe about his nature or intentions. But let me give you practical guidance, wisdom born from 10 millennia of watching the Imperium change and endure. First, do not make the mistake of believing that, because the Emperor was not literally divine, his example has no value. He was the most remarkable being humanity has ever produced, possessing wisdom and power that remain unmatched. Study his actions, his decisions, his strategies. Learn from them, not as religious dogma, but as the legacy of a supreme tactician and visionary. When you face impossible situations, ask yourself, what would the Emperor have done? Not the god figure of imperial faith, but the general who unified terror, who launched the Great Crusade, who built an empire from the ruins of civilization. That practical, strategic approach to problems, that willingness to make hard choices and accept terrible costs, that is the real gift he left us. Second, understand that faith and truth are not necessarily enemies. The Emperor was wrong to dismiss faith as purely irrational weakness. Faith provides strength, unity, purpose, things that pure reason cannot always deliver. But he was also right that faith unchecked by reason becomes superstition, that belief without questioning becomes dangerous. You can believe in the Emperor's protection while also maintaining the rational, practical approach to warfare that he taught. You can pray before battle and also ensure your weapons are properly maintained. You can see the Emperor as humanity's greatest defender while also acknowledging that he was not infallible, that his vision had flaws, that his methods sometimes created as many problems as they solved. The goal is not to choose between faith and reason, but to hold both in balance. Let faith give you courage when tactical calculations suggest despair. Let reason guide your decisions when faith might lead you to foolish martyrdom. Be warriors of the Emperor in every sense, faithful to his memory, but also thinking, adapting, learning as he would have wanted his sons to think and adapt and learn. Third, accept that you will face moral ambiguity in every significant decision you make. The Emperor's great weakness was his certainty, his belief that he always knew the right answer. Don't make the same mistake. Acknowledge that most situations will have no clear right choice, only options with different costs and benefits. When you must decide whether to save civilians or pursue a tactical objective, when you must choose between honoring ancient traditions or adapting to new circumstances, when you must balance the immediate needs of your chapter against the long-term requirements of the Imperium, do not expect easy answers. Consider the options carefully, make the best choice you can with the information available, and then live with the consequences. The Emperor made terrible choices because he believed they were necessary. You will make terrible choices for the same reason. The difference is that you can acknowledge the cost of those choices, can mourn what is lost, even as you accept that loss as necessary. That acknowledgement, that recognition of the price paid, is what keeps you human, even when your duty requires inhuman actions. Chaplain Mordecai speaks up, his voice no longer hostile, but thoughtful. What you describe sounds like heresy to the ecclesiarchy, Ancient One. If we preach this balanced approach, if we teach our brothers to question as well as believe, we will face accusations, possibly even investigation by the Inquisition. How do we protect ourselves while following the path you describe? You don't, Tiberius responds bluntly. Not completely. Speaking truth in an Imperium built on comfortable lies always carries risk. But you have advantages that others lack. You are Space Marines, independent from the normal chains of Imperial authority. Your chapter has maintained its traditions for thousands of years, and those traditions provide cover for interpretations that might be deemed problematic if coming from ordinary citizens. Teach your brothers to be politically astute. When speaking with outsiders, with representatives of the ecclesiarchy or Inquisition or other imperial authorities, use the language of faith. Speak of the Emperor's divinity, of your devotion to his will, of your role as his instruments. Give them no clear reason to question your loyalty. But among yourselves, in the privacy of your chapter, maintain the balance I described. Study the Emperor as a tactical and strategic genius. Question your traditions when they seem counterproductive. Adapt your doctrine to meet changing circumstances. Be what the Emperor tried to create, thinking warriors, not blind fanatics. And if the Inquisition does come knocking, if accusations are made, remember that you have one unassailable defense: results. If your chapter continues to serve with distinction, if you destroy the Emperor's enemies and protect his Imperium, then questions about the exact nature of your faith become secondary. The Imperium is pragmatic at its core. As long as you deliver victory, they will tolerate a great deal of theological flexibility. Brother Cassius nods slowly, then asks the question that Tiberius has been expecting. What about you, Ancient One? You have spoken truths today that many would call heretical. What happens to you when this conversation ends? Will you be silenced, destroyed, declared tainted by the long years in the sarcophagus? Perhaps, Tiberius answers calmly. I have broken a silence I maintained for 9,000 years. I have challenged doctrine that the Imperium has held sacred for longer than most current institutions have existed. There will be consequences, and I accept them. But consider what this means for you. I am ancient, beyond any reasonable span of service. I have fought in the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and countless campaigns since. I have seen the full arc of the Imperium's history, from its birth to its current state. My testimony carries weight precisely because of my age, because I am a living bridge to the days when the Emperor walked among us. If they destroy me for speaking these truths, they destroy that bridge. They eliminate one of the last connections to the Imperium as it was meant to be, and in doing so, they prove my point, that the Imperium has strayed so far from the Emperor's vision that it cannot tolerate witnesses to what he actually believed. I do not think they will take that step. Oh, there will be arguments, debates, possibly investigations. But ultimately, I suspect the chapter will protect me, will claim that I speak from the confusion of great age, that my words should be understood in context of my service rather than taken as theological statements. They will smooth things over, make excuses, and ensure that I can return to my sleep without official condemnation. But even if I'm wrong, even if this conversation is the last I will ever have, I regret nothing. You needed to hear this. The chapter needed to hear this. And I needed to finally speak after so many years of diplomatic evasion and careful half-truths. Tiberius pauses, his optical sensors moving across the assembled Marines, meeting the gaze of each one in turn. Let me give you my final testimony, the core message I want you to carry forward. The Emperor was not perfect. The Imperium is not perfect. Faith is not perfect. Reason is not perfect. But humanity, flawed and struggling and dying though we may be, is worth fighting for. That is the truth that transcends all theological debates, all questions about the Emperor's nature, all concerns about the Imperium's failures. We serve because humanity is worth serving. We fight because our species is worth fighting for. We endure because human survival is worth the price we pay for it. Everything else, all the complexity about faith and reason and the Emperor's vision, is secondary to that fundamental truth. So, when you face your next battle, when you must make your next impossible choice, when you struggle with doubts about doctrine or faith or purpose, remember this: you are the Emperor's Space Marines. You are humanity's defenders. And that role, that duty, that identity is meaningful whether you see the Emperor as God or man or something in between. Serve well, think clearly, fight courageously, and trust that if you do those things, if you maintain the balance between faith and reason, between tradition and adaptation, between absolute commitment and clear-eyed assessment, you will be worthy of the Emperor's legacy, regardless of what he may have wanted or believed. That is my final testimony. That is what 10,000 years of service has taught me, and it is all I have to offer to warriors who face a galaxy more terrible than anything I fought in an Imperium more complex than anything the Emperor imagined. The chamber remains silent as Tiberius's words fade. Then, slowly, Brother Cassius steps forward and kneels before the ancient warrior. Thank you, Ancient One, for your truth, for your service, and for trusting us with the burden you have carried for so long. We will not fail the faith you have placed in us. One by one, the other Marines follow his example, kneeling before the towering Dreadnought in a gesture that is neither worship nor mere respect, but something deeper: acknowledgement of the gift they have been given and the responsibility that comes with it. Ancient Tiberius regards them in silence, and if he could still weep, he might have in this moment. Because he has finally done what he should have done millennia ago, passed the burden of truth to the next generation, trusted them to carry forward the complex reality of the Emperor's legacy, rather than the comfortable simplifications of faith or dogma. Rise, he says finally. Return to your duties. Speak of what you have learned here with wisdom, teaching those who are ready and protecting those who are not. And when the time comes for me to sleep again, know that I will rest easier, having finally spoken the truth I should have shared long ago. The Emperor protects, Chaplain Mordecai says, and there is new understanding in his voice, recognition that those words can mean different things to different people while remaining fundamentally true. The Emperor protects, the other Marines echo, and Tiberius repeats it as well, the ancient affirmation carrying weight earned through 10,000 years of service. And perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere in the Golden Throne Room deep in the heart of Terra, a consciousness that was once the Emperor and is now something more, something other, something that even Tiberius could not begin to comprehend, hears those words and understands that his truest servants are not the ones who worship him blindly, but the ones who think clearly and serve humanity wisely, carrying forward not his exact vision, but his ultimate purpose: human survival against impossible odds. That is all any of them can do, all any of them have ever done, and somehow, despite everything, it has been enough. Thank you for watching this exploration of what happens when an ancient dreadnought who met the Emperor finally breaks his silence. If you found this video interesting, please consider liking and subscribing for more deep dives into Warhammer 40k lore. The Emperor protects, in whatever way you understand that protection to mean.